My name is Walt Bremer, and for 31 years, I've run cattle on 400 acres outside a small ranching community, where most of my neighbors still wave from their trucks instead of texting. My grandfather bought this land in 1962. My father raised me on it. I always figured I'd hand it down to my own kids someday. Dirt and fences and all. So when I opened my mailbox last spring and found a letter from the Homeowners Association, informing me that a $9 million utility pipeline easement had been granted across the western edge of my ranch, I genuinely thought it was a mistake. I called the HOA office. A young woman named Priya answered, and she was kind enough, but she confirmed it wasn't a mistake. Apparently 3 years earlier, when the surrounding development was platted, a blanket utility easement had been recorded that technically touched a sliver of my property line near an old access road. The energy company building out a new regional line had since expanded their route, and somewhere in committee meetings I was never invited to, my 100-foot strip of pasture became part of a $9 million infrastructure deal. I want to be clear about something. I'm not against progress. My own propane line runs through county easement. I understand the world needs power and water and gas to move from one place to another. What bothered me wasn't the pipeline. It was that nobody had knocked on my door. I drove out to the spot myself. Survey stakes, pink ribbon tied to mesquite branches, a row of orange flags running straight through what has been my best winter grazing pasture since before I was born. No one had called. No one had asked. The letter I'd received was, as far as the HOA was concerned, a courtesy notice, not a negotiation. I'll admit, my first instinct was anger, but I've learned over 3 decades of ranching that anger doesn't move fence posts, and it doesn't move lawyers either. So I called my attorney, a steady, soft-spoken woman named Denise Okafor, who has handled my water rights disputes since I was 35 years old. Denise read through the recorded easement documents for 2 days straight. What she found surprised both of us. The original 2021 filing described a shared utility corridor not to exceed 20 feet, intended for community water and electrical lines. The new $9 million pipeline project had been layered on top of that old language, using a clause about future expansion compatible with existing easement purpose. In plain English, somebody had stretched a 20-foot neighborhood utility strip into a 100-foot industrial pipeline corridor, and they've done it without amending the recorded easement or notifying the underlying landowner. This isn't about stopping the pipeline, Denise told me over coffee at her office. It's about making sure you're treated like a property owner instead of a footnote. She filed an emergency motion asking the county to pause active construction on my parcel until the easement scope could be reviewed by a judge. 3 days later, while the survey crew was setting up their equipment near the southern fence line, a county clerk arrived with paperwork, and the crew supervisor agreed, without any fuss at all, to hold off until the matter was sorted. I remember standing by the gate that morning, coffee in hand, watching grown men in hard hats simply pack up their gear and wait. There was no shouting, nobody raised their voice. The supervisor, a guy named Marcus, actually walked over and shook my hand. "Wish more landowners called their lawyers before we showed up instead of after," he said. "Saves everybody a headache." I asked him how often that actually happened. Landowners catching a problem before the trucks rolled in. He shrugged and said, maybe 1 in 20. Most folks, he told me, either don't read the recorded documents closely enough to catch a discrepancy, or they assume that once the HOA signs off, there's nothing left to discuss. I thought about how close I'd come to being one of those 20, and how easily I might have just shrugged at that mailbox letter and gone on with my morning chores. That conversation changed something for me. I'd been bracing for a fight, and instead I found a man who, like me, just wanted clear answers and fair treatment. The pause gave Denise the room she needed to negotiate properly instead of reactively. Over the following 6 weeks, she sat down with the utility company's land acquisition team and the HOA's board attorney, and slowly, a different picture emerged. The utility company hadn't set out to take advantage of anyone. Their land team had simply relied on old HOA paperwork that nobody had double-checked in 3 years. Once the discrepancy was laid out plainly, their senior right-of-way manager, A soft-spoken man named Dale Whitfield drove out personally to walk the property line with me. We spent 2 hours out there, just the two of us, and my old dog Biscuit trotting along the fence. Dale asked questions I hadn't expected, about my cattle rotation, about the spring that fed my stock tank, about which exact acres mattered most to my operation. He wasn't performing concern. He was actually listening. "We can reroute about 60 feet north," he said, looking at his tablet. "It adds maybe 4 days to construction, and a little more cost, but it keeps the pipeline off your best grazing ground, and follows the old fence line instead of cutting across it." I hadn't expected that kind of flexibility. I'd expected a fight over money. Instead, Dale offered something better, a route that respected the actual use of the land, not just the legal description of it. The compensation conversation that followed was frankly the easiest part, because the corrected easement now reflected the true industrial nature of the corridor. Rather than a quiet neighborhood utility strip, the valuation changed dramatically. What started as a token courtesy payment buried in HOA paperwork became a proper market rate easement agreement, negotiated directly between me and the utility company, with Denise reviewing every line. The final number wasn't life-changing in the way lottery winnings are, but it was enough to resurface 2 miles of ranch road, replace 40-year-old fencing along the new corridor, and put a healthy cushion into the herd expansion I'd been putting off for years. I called my 2 kids that evening to tell them about the settlement. My daughter, who's studying agricultural economics 2 states away, laughed and said, "Dad, you basically just ran a negotiation seminar on a guy with a clipboard." My son, who still helps me move cattle most weekends, just asked whether the new fence line would hold up better than the old one. I told him it would. Galvanized steel instead of the barbed wire his great-grandfather had, strung up decades ago. He seemed more excited about that than the dollar figure, honestly, and I understood exactly why. Fences you can lean on for 40 years mean more out here than a number in a bank account. What mattered more to me than the dollar figure was something Dale said as we shook hands on the typical final survey day. Most of these projects roll through 20 properties without anyone asking a single question. You asked the right one at the right time, and it made the whole route better. The HOA board, to their credit, didn't dig in or get defensive once the facts were clear. At their next open meeting, they amended their easement notification policy so that any property abutting a recorded utility corridor receives direct written notice, not a generic mailer, anytime a third party seeks to expand or repurpose that easement. Priya, the young woman who first took my call, told me afterward that mine was the case that finally got the policy changed. 2 other ranching families nearby thanked me personally. They'd received similar letters and had simply assumed there was nothing to be done. Construction resumed in early summer, 60 feet north of where the original stakes had stood, tracing the old fence line instead of slicing through open pasture. I watched the crew work for a few mornings, mostly out of curiosity. Marcus waved every time he saw my truck. By the time the trench was backfilled and reseeded, you could barely tell the corridor was there at all. Just a faint seam of younger grass following the fence. These days, when people in town ask me about the pipeline thing, I tell them the truth. It never needed to be a war. It needed someone willing to ask a careful question, a lawyer willing to read the fine print twice, and a utility company willing to actually listen when the answer came back different than expected. Dale and I still trade texts occasionally. He sent me a photo last month of the regrown grass along the corridor, calling it the prettiest pipeline route in 3 counties. My grandfather always said the land tells you the truth if you bronzer, for who's patient enough to walk it slowly. I think about that every time I ride the fence line now, past the spot where a 100-foot industrial corridor could have cut through the heart of my best pasture, and instead found a quieter path along ground that was already disturbed by an old fence anyway. Some evenings I still walk that new fence line just before sunset, Biscuit trotting ahead of me the way he always does, and I think about how differently the whole season could have gone if I'd tossed that first letter in a drawer instead of picking up the phone. The ranch is still mine, still whole, still ready for my kids someday. Fences mended now, and grass growing back thick and green. And somewhere under 60 feet of topsoil and new grass, $9 million worth of pipeline runs quietly along, doing exactly what it was supposed to do all along, staying out of everyone's way.